Cole's grease-stained hands trembled as he adjusted his tie one last time. The oil under his fingernails wouldn't wash clean. A permanent reminder to everyone at Riverside Gardens that he was just a mechanic. Amanda's father stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chapel like a blade. "My daughter deserves better than a man who fixes cars for a living." The wedding guests shifted uncomfortably as Cole's 9-year-old daughter Harper grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face. Then the ground began to shake. The thunderous roar of helicopter rotors filled the air, drowning out the gasps of 300 guests. Through the stained-glass windows, 100 black SUVs surrounded the garden like a military fortress. 1,000 Navy SEALs in full dress uniforms emerged from the convoy, their boots striking the pavement in perfect unison. The truth about Cole Brennan was about to turn this small Indiana town upside down. 6 hours earlier, the morning sun had cast long shadows across Brennan's auto repair, where Cole stood beneath the hood of a rusted Ford pickup. The familiar scent of motor oil and coffee filled the small garage as he worked, his movements precise despite the weight of the day ahead. Harper sat on an overturned crate nearby, swinging her legs as she watched her father's weathered hands navigate the engine's maze of belts and hoses. The radio crackled in the background, the local DJ's voice cutting through the static to announce the annual Operation Valor Heroes ceremony at Cedar Valley Veterans Honor Park. Cole's wrench slipped, clattering against the metal frame as his body tensed at the mention of the event. Harper noticed immediately, her bright eyes studying her father's face with the intensity that had become second nature since her mother's death 3 years ago. "Daddy, you okay?" she asked, sliding down from the crate to stand beside him. Cole forced a smile, wiping his hands on the red shop rag that had been his constant companion for the past 3 years. The garage walls were lined with faded certificates from his mechanic training, a few family photos, and tucked in the corner, barely visible behind a stack of tire catalogs, hung a small poster for Cedar Valley Veterans Honor Park. Every morning for the past 3 years, Cole had glanced at that poster while brewing his coffee, feeling the familiar twist in his stomach that came with memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Today was different, though. Today was supposed to be about new beginnings, about giving Harper the mother figure she deserved, about proving to Amanda's family that a simple mechanic could be enough. The drive to Riverside Gardens took them through the heart of Cedar Valley, past the white picket fences and manicured lawns that spoke of lives far removed from Cole's daily reality of calloused hands and grease-stained coveralls. Harper pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the town's elite emerge from their colonial homes in their Sunday best, all heading toward the same destination. Cole's stomach churned as he thought about the 300 guests who would be watching him today, judging him, wondering what Amanda Foster, the town's beloved elementary school teacher, saw in a man who fixed engines for a living. The wedding venue appeared around the bend, its elegant Victorian architecture and sprawling rose gardens a testament to the Foster family's standing in Cedar Valley society. As Cole pulled into the parking lot, he caught sight of the expensive cars already lined up, Mercedes, BMWs, and Audis gleaming in the morning sun like silent accusations. Amanda was waiting for them in the bridal suite, her blonde hair perfectly styled beneath a delicate veil that had belonged to her grandmother. When she saw Cole and Harper approach through the French doors, her face lit up with the same warm smile that had captured his heart 18 months ago when Harper had fallen off her bicycle near the school playground. Amanda had been the one to clean Harper's scraped knees, the one to drive them to the emergency room when the cut proved deeper than expected, and the one who had somehow seen past Cole's rough exterior to the devoted father underneath. She knelt down to Harper's level, adjusting the small flower crown that matched her own bouquet, and whispered something that made the little girl giggle. For a moment, watching them together, Cole allowed himself to believe that everything would work out, that love might actually be enough to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock sharp, with guests filing into the garden chapel that overlooked Cedar Valley's rolling hills. Cole stood at the altar in his rented black tuxedo, feeling like an imposter among the sea of faces that represented everything he wasn't: educated, wealthy, established. Amanda's family occupied the first 3 rows on the bride's side, their designer clothing and perfect posture creating an invisible barrier between them and the handful of Cole's friends scattered throughout the back rows. Harper sat in the front row beside Patricia Foster, Amanda's mother, whose icy blue eyes had never quite warmed to the idea of her daughter marrying beneath their social station. The officiant, Reverend Matthews, began the traditional ceremony with words about love conquering all, but Cole could feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Robert Foster rose from his seat with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to commanding courtrooms and boardrooms. His silver hair caught the afternoon light as he cleared his throat, the sound carrying across the silent garden like a judge's gavel. "I'm sorry, Reverend, but I must speak," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The wedding guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as 300 pairs of eyes turned towards the distinguished lawyer who had built his reputation on winning impossible cases. Amanda's face drained of color as she realized what was about to unfold, her bouquet trembling in her hands like autumn leaves before a storm. Harper's small hand found Cole's arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his tuxedo as she sensed the danger in the air without fully understanding its source. "My daughter deserves better than a man who fixes cars for a living," Robert continued, his words precise and cutting as surgical instruments. "She deserves someone who can provide for her, someone who moves in the same circles, someone who understands what it means to be a foster in this community." The garden fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. Cole felt the familiar burn of shame creep up his neck, the same feeling he'd carried since childhood when teachers had looked at his second-hand clothes and free lunch tickets with barely concealed pity. Amanda stepped forward, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak as she faced her father. "Daddy, please don't do this. Cole is a good man, a devoted father. He's given me more happiness in 18 months than I ever thought possible." But Robert Foster was just getting started, his lawyer's instincts taking over as he sensed victory within reach. "Happiness?" he scoffed, gesturing toward Cole with the same dismissive wave he might use to brush away an annoying insect. "What happens when the novelty wears off, Amanda? What happens when you realize you've tied yourself to a man with no prospects, no education, no future beyond that grease pit he calls a business?" The words hit Cole like physical blows, each syllable designed to strip away whatever dignity he'd managed to build over the past 3 years. He could see his co-workers from the garage in the back rows, their faces reflecting the same humiliation he felt burning in his chest. Harper's grip on his arm tightened as tears began to stream down her face. The little girl's world crumbling around her, just as it had when her mother had lost her battle with cancer. Brandon Foster, Amanda's younger brother and a successful attorney in his own right, stood to join his father's assault. "Cole, I'm sure you're a decent enough fellow," he said, with the condescending tone reserved for children and those deemed intellectually inferior. "But marriage isn't just about feelings. It's about compatibility, about building a life together with someone who shares your values, your background, your understanding of what success looks like." His Ivy League education dripped from every word as he continued his clinical dissection of Cole's worth as a husband. "Amanda has her master's degree in education. She speaks 3 languages. She's traveled to 15 countries. What exactly do you bring to this union beyond your willingness to work with your hands?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Cole found himself without an answer that would satisfy this courtroom of his peers. The humiliation reached its crescendo when Patricia Foster rose gracefully from her seat, her pearl necklace catching the light as she moved with the fluid confidence of someone born into privilege. "Cole, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Surely you can see that this is all wrong. You're a lovely man, and Harper is a delightful child, but you simply don't belong in our world." She gestured toward the elegant gathering, as if presenting evidence in a case already decided. "Look around you. These are Amanda's friends, her colleagues, her community. Can you honestly say you feel comfortable here? Can you provide the kind of life Amanda has always known?" The question struck at Cole's deepest insecurities, the fears he'd carried since the day he'd fallen in love with Amanda Foster and realized their worlds were separated by more than just money. Harper's sobs grew louder as she watched her father being torn apart by words as sharp as broken glass. The 9-year-old had endured enough loss in her short life, had watched her mother waste away in a hospital bed, had clung to her father through the dark months that followed, and had finally begun to believe in happy endings when Amanda entered their lives. Now that hope was being shattered by adults who spoke in measured tones about compatibility and social standing while her heart broke into pieces. "Stop it!" Harper suddenly cried out, her voice cutting through the garden like a knife. "My daddy is the best man in the whole world. He works hard and he loves me and he makes Amanda happy." But her words were lost in the ocean of adult certainty, dismissed as the emotional outburst of a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of adult relationships. Cole felt something die inside him as he looked at his daughter's tear-stained face, knowing that once again he had failed to protect her from the cruelties of a world that judged worth by bank accounts and zip codes. The weight of 3 years of trying to rebuild their lives after Jessica's death crashed down on him like a collapsed building, and for the first time since Amanda had said yes to his proposal, he began to wonder if the Fosters were right. Maybe Harper deserved better than a father who smelled like motor oil and whose idea of fine dining was the diner on Main Street. Maybe Amanda deserved someone who could take her to the country club galas and charity events that filled her social calendar, someone whose hands were soft and whose bank account could support her dreams of travel and adventure. As Cole prepared to step away from the altar, to spare Amanda the embarrassment of being married to Cedar Valley's most unsuitable groom, the distant sound of helicopter rotors began to penetrate the garden's shocked silence. At first the sound was barely audible over the whispered conversations and Harper's continued sobbing, but it grew steadily louder, more insistent, until even Robert Foster paused in his character assassination to glance skyward. The rhythmic thumping grew from a whisper to a roar, the mechanical heartbeat of military aircraft approaching at high speed. Wedding guests began to look around nervously as the sound intensified, their afternoon of social drama suddenly interrupted by something far beyond their understanding. The windows of the chapel began to rattle in their frames as the helicopters drew closer, and Cole felt a familiar chill run down his spine. The same sensation he'd experienced countless times in Afghanistan, when incoming aircraft meant the difference between life and death. The first Black Hawk appeared over the tree line like a mechanical bird of prey, its military markings clearly visible against the peaceful backdrop of Cedar Valley's pastoral landscape. Then came another and another, until the sky above Riverside Gardens was filled with a formation of helicopters that belonged in a war zone, not at a wedding in rural Indiana. The roar was deafening now, drowning out the gasps and screams of 300 wedding guests who had never seen anything more threatening than a heated school board meeting. Car alarms began wailing in the parking lot as the helicopter's downdraft shook the ground, and Cole's heart began to pound with a rhythm he recognized from his darkest nightmares, the percussion of incoming danger that had haunted his sleep for the past 8 years. The convoy appeared next, streaming down the winding road that led to Riverside Gardens like an invasion force. 100 black SUVs moved in perfect formation, their tinted windows and government license plates announcing their official nature to anyone with eyes to see. The vehicles surrounded the wedding venue with military precision, creating an impenetrable perimeter that transformed the elegant garden party into something resembling a high-security operation. Wedding guests stumbled over each other in their designer clothing, some screaming, others recording everything on their phones, all of them suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far beyond the scope of a small-town social event. Robert Foster's confident demeanor cracked for the first time as he realized his carefully orchestrated humiliation of Cole had been interrupted by forces beyond his control or understanding. The SUVs disgorged their passengers in synchronized waves, and Cole's blood turned to ice as he recognized the uniforms, the bearing, the unmistakable presence of active-duty Navy SEALs. 1,000 of America's most elite warriors emerged from the vehicles in full dress uniform, their movements coordinated with the precision that came from years of training in the world's most dangerous environments. The sight was overwhelming row upon row of men who represented the pinnacle of military excellence, their ribbons and medals catching the afternoon sun like captured starlight. Each SEAL moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious, their presence transforming the garden wedding into something resembling a military ceremony of the highest order. At the center of this impressive display walked a man whose uniform bore the stars of a general, his silver hair and weathered face speaking of decades spent in service to his country. General Harrison Webb had commanded respect in every theater of operation, from Somalia to Syria, but today his mission was personal, to honor a debt that had weighed on his conscience for 8 long years. Behind him walked a group of men whose faces Cole recognized despite the years that had passed, men whose lives he had saved in a moment of heroism that had cost him everything he held dear about his identity. They were older now, some bearing scars from battles fought after Operation Valor, but their eyes held the same gratitude and respect that had marked their faces on that terrible day in the Hindu Kush, when death had seemed certain and salvation had come in the form of a young SEAL who refused to leave anyone behind. General Webb's voice carried across the stunned silence of the garden as he approached the altar, where Cole stood frozen in disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general announced, his words carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing heads of state and military commanders. "We apologize for interrupting this celebration, but we have come to Cedar Valley today to honor a debt that has gone unpaid for far too long." His eyes found Cole's face, and 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumbled in an instant. The general's expression softened with something that might have been paternal pride as he continued, "We are here to honor Lieutenant Cole Brennan, United States Navy SEALs, recipient of the Medal of Honor, and the man who single-handedly saved 47 lives during Operation Valor in Afghanistan." The revelation hit the wedding guests like a physical force, 300 voices falling silent as the true identity of Cedar Valley's humble mechanic was revealed. Amanda's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden understanding as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. The nightmares that sometimes woke Cole in the early hours, his uncanny ability to sense danger, the way he moved through their small apartment with the silent efficiency of someone trained in environments where noise meant death. It all made sense now in the harsh light of revelation. Harper looked up at her father with wonder and confusion, seeing him for the first time, not just as the man who packed her lunch and helped with homework, but as someone whose life had contained chapters she'd never imagined. Robert Foster's face had gone ashen, the blood draining from his features as the implications of his public attack on a Medal of Honor recipient began to sink in. His legal mind, trained to assess situations and outcomes, immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of his mistake. The man he had just humiliated in front of 300 witnesses was not just any mechanic. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history, a hero whose actions had saved dozens of lives and earned him the nation's highest award for valor. The same hands that Robert had dismissed as fit only for manual labor had once wielded weapons in defense of freedom, had pulled wounded comrades from burning vehicles, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for an entire platoon of America's finest soldiers. General Webb continued his address, his voice cutting through the afternoon air with the precision of a ceremonial sword. 8 years ago, Lieutenant Brennan led a rescue mission behind enemy lines when his unit was ambushed in the Kunar province. Despite being outnumbered 10-1 and suffering multiple wounds, he refused to abandon his fallen comrades. The general's words painted a picture of heroism that seemed impossible to reconcile with the quiet man who spent his days elbow-deep in engine blocks and transmission fluid. For 6 hours, he held off enemy forces while coordinating the evacuation of 47 wounded soldiers, including my own son, Captain James Webb. When the rescue helicopters finally arrived, they found Lieutenant Brennan still fighting, still protecting his men, even though he had been shot 3 times and was losing blood at a rate that should have killed him. Captain James Webb stepped forward from the formation of SEALs, his face bearing the weathered look of someone who had seen combat in multiple theaters of operation. The resemblance to his father was unmistakable. The same steel-gray eyes, the same bearing that spoke of unshakable confidence forged in the crucible of battle. "Cole Brennan saved my life," he said simply, his voice carrying across the garden with quiet intensity. "He carried me 2 miles through enemy territory after I took shrapnel to both legs. He stayed with me when any reasonable person would have left me behind to save himself." The captain's eyes found Cole's face, and the mechanic saw in them the same gratitude that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. The weight of lives saved, of futures preserved, of families kept whole by decisions made in moments when heroes were born or cowards were revealed. The formation of 1,000 SEALs moved as one, their right hands snapping to their foreheads in a salute that represented the highest form of military respect. The sight was breathtaking row upon row of America's most elite warriors paying homage to one of their own, a man who had embodied the SEAL creed of never leave a fallen comrade, even when it meant certain death. The salute held for a full minute, a minute that stretched into eternity as Cole stood frozen at the altar, his carefully constructed new identity crumbling around him like a house of cards. For 3 years he had hidden from this recognition, had chosen anonymity, and the simple satisfaction of honest work over the burden of being known as a hero. Now, in front of Amanda's family and the entire social elite of Cedar Valley, that choice was being stripped away. Harper's voice cut through the silence like a bell, clear and proud, and filled with a child's simple acceptance of the impossible. "My daddy saved 47 people?" she asked, looking up at General Webb with eyes that sparkled with newfound pride. The general knelt down to her level, his weathered face softening as he addressed the daughter of the man who had become a legend among those who knew the truth about Operation Valor. "Your daddy is the bravest man I've ever known," he said gently. "He's a real American hero, and everyone in this uniform owes him a debt we can never fully repay." Harper's tears had stopped flowing, replaced by a glow of pride that seemed to radiate from her small frame as she looked at her father with new eyes, seeing him not as the humble mechanic who had raised her alone, but as someone whose courage had saved dozens of other children's fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. Amanda stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the garden. Her face was a canvas of emotions, shock at the revelation, understanding of the man she had fallen in love with, and a fierce pride that seemed to transform her from the inside out. "You never told me," she whispered, her hand reaching for Cole's scarred and calloused fingers. Cole looked down at their joined hands, seeing for the first time not the contrast between her smooth skin and his rough palms, but the connection that had drawn them together from that first day when she had tended to Harper's scraped knees. "I wanted you to love me for who I am now," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the continued rumble of helicopter rotors. "Not for what I did in the war." The transformation in the wedding guests was visible and immediate, 300 faces reflecting the shift from social gossip to genuine awe. The same people who had whispered about Amanda's questionable choice in husbands now found themselves in the presence of living history, a man whose actions had been studied in military academies and whose name appeared in classified after-action reports that most civilians would never see. The elegant ladies in their designer hats and the distinguished gentlemen in their tailored suits suddenly seemed small and insignificant compared to the warriors who had traveled from around the world to honor one of their own. Patricia Foster clutched her pearl necklace as if it were a lifeline, her carefully constructed social superiority crumbling in the face of genuine heroism. Robert Foster approached Cole with halting steps, his earlier confidence replaced by the uncertain gait of someone who had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. The distinguished lawyer who had built his career on his ability to read people and situations had failed spectacularly to recognize the quality of the man he had just attempted to destroy. "Lieutenant Brennan," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. I had no idea. My words were unconscionable. The apology hung in the air like incense, insufficient to undo the damage but necessary for Robert's own conscience. Cole looked at the man who had just publicly humiliated him, seeing not an enemy, but someone trapped by the same social expectations that had driven Cole into hiding in the first place. General Webb stepped between them, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the garden. "Mr. Foster," he said with the diplomatic tone he used when addressing foreign dignitaries, "your daughter is marrying one of the finest men it has been my privilege to know." Lieutenant Brennan left the military not because he was forced out, but because he chose a different kind of service-raising his daughter and contributing to his community in ways that may seem humble but are no less valuable. The general's words carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of endorsement that could not be questioned or dismissed. Any family would be honored to call him son, any community blessed to have him as a neighbor. Your daughter has chosen well. The ceremony resumed with a surreal quality, as if the participants were moving through a dream that mixed the familiar rituals of marriage with the overwhelming presence of military power. Reverend Matthews, clearly shaken by the unprecedented interruption, struggled to return to the traditional words of the wedding service, while 1,000 seals stood at attention in the garden around them. Amanda and Cole exchanged vows in voices that shook with emotion, their words taking on deeper meaning in the context of revelations that had transformed their understanding of each other. When Cole slipped the simple gold band onto Amanda's finger, his hands no longer trembled with insecurity, but with the knowledge that she was choosing him not in spite of his past, but because of the man it had shaped him to become. Harper stepped forward as the ceremony concluded, her small voice ringing clear in the garden as she addressed the assembled SEALs. "Thank you for coming to my daddy's wedding." she said, with the perfect politeness her father had taught her. "I always knew he was the best daddy in the world, but I didn't know he was a hero, too." The formation of warriors, men who had faced down terrorists and dictators, seemed to melt at the words of the 9-year-old girl whose faith in her father had never wavered. Several of the SEALs wiped their eyes discreetly, remembering their own children and the sacrifices military families made for the greater good of their nation. As the helicopters prepared to depart and the convoy of SUVs began their coordinated withdrawal, General Webb approached Cole one final time. "The offer stands," he said quietly, speaking words that only Cole could hear. "You have a place with us whenever you choose to return. But I understand why you've chosen this life instead." His eyes moved to Harper, who was showing her flower crown to a group of fascinated SEALs, and then to Amanda, who was accepting congratulations from wedding guests who seemed to see her with new eyes. Some kinds of courage are displayed on battlefields, and others are shown in the daily choice to build a life worth living. You've mastered both. The general's handshake was firm and final, the closing of a chapter that had defined Cole's nightmares for 8 years. The reception that followed was unlike anything Cedar Valley society had ever experienced. The local caterer had not prepared for the addition of 1,000 military personnel to the guest list, but the SEALs had come prepared with their own field kitchens and supplies, transforming the elegant garden party into something that resembled a cross between a state dinner and a military celebration. Stories of Cole's heroism circulated among the wedding guests like legends come to life, each tale adding another layer to the mythology of the quiet mechanic who had hidden in plain sight among them for 3 years. Children from the town gathered around groups of SEALs, listening with wide eyes to carefully edited stories of adventure and brotherhood, while their parents struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the hero he had always been. Brandon Foster approached Cole during the reception, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine humility. "I owe you an apology that goes beyond words," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that asked for forgiveness rather than demanded acknowledgement. "I judged you by standards that suddenly seem incredibly small and meaningless." Cole accepted the handshake, seeing in Brandon's eyes the same recognition that had appeared in his father's face, the understanding that true worth could not be measured by degrees or bank accounts or social connections. "We all make judgments based on what we can see," Cole replied. "I chose to let people see only part of who I am. That's on me as much as anyone." Patricia Foster found herself in conversation with Captain Webb, the general's son whose life Cole had saved 8 years earlier. The captain spoke with quiet intensity about the day that had changed everything, describing the ambush that had left him bleeding in a ditch while enemy fire rained down around them. "Your son-in-law appeared out of nowhere like something from a movie," he told her. "I was sure I was going to die in that desert, leave my wife a widow and my kids without a father. Cole Brennan made sure that didn't happen." Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she began to understand the magnitude of the man her daughter had chosen, a man whose heroism had preserved not just one life, but an entire family's future happiness. As the afternoon faded into evening, the last of the military vehicles departed Cedar Valley, leaving behind a community that had been forever changed by the revelation of the hero in their midst. The wedding guests lingered longer than usual, reluctant to end an afternoon that had transformed from social embarrassment to historic significance. Cole and Amanda stood together on the terrace overlooking the garden, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched Harper play with children who now looked at her with the respect due to a hero's daughter. "Why didn't you tell me?" Amanda asked again, her voice free of accusation but filled with wonder at the man she had married. Cole was quiet for a long moment, watching the last helicopter disappear into the distance. Because I wanted you to love Cole the mechanic, not Lieutenant Brennan the war hero. He said finally. That man did what he had to do in impossible circumstances, but he's not who I wanted to be for you and Harper. I wanted to be someone who builds things instead of destroying them, someone who comes home every night instead of deploying to places where good people die. His voice carried the weight of 8 years spent trying to reconcile the warrior he had been with the father he needed to become. The medals and recognition belong to someone I used to be. The man you married is who I chose to become. Amanda turned to face him, her hands framing his face as she looked into eyes that now held depths she was only beginning to understand. You think those are two different people, she said softly. But they're not. The same courage that saved 47 soldiers is what made you capable of raising Harper alone after Jessica died. The same strength that held off the enemy forces for 6 hours is what gets you up every morning to provide for your family. You didn't become someone different, you just found a new way to serve. Her words hung between them like a bridge, connecting the warrior's past with the father's present, helping Cole see himself through eyes that loved both versions of the man he was. The drive home to their small apartment above the garage felt different now, as if the familiar streets of Cedar Valley had been transformed by the day's revelations. Harper chattered excitedly in the back seat, her flower crown askew, and her dress wrinkled from playing with children who would remember this day for the rest of their lives. "Daddy, will you tell me about the soldiers you saved?" she asked, her voice bright with curiosity and pride. Cole caught Amanda's eye in the rearview mirror, seeing her encouraging nod, and for the first time in 3 years, he began to consider that some stories were worth telling, some truths worth sharing. That night, as Cedar Valley settled into sleep, the Brennan family sat together in their modest living room, and Cole opened the locked metal box he had kept hidden in the back of his closet. Harper's eyes grew wide as she saw the Medal of Honor, its blue ribbon and bronze star seeming to glow in the lamplight. But it wasn't the medal that captured her attention, it was the photographs tucked beneath it, images of her father in military uniform surrounded by the men whose lives he had saved. For the first time, she saw not just her daddy the mechanic, but the hero he had always been, the man whose courage had given 47 families the gift of another day, another year, another lifetime with their loved ones. Amanda studied the photographs with the intensity of someone discovering a hidden chapter in a favorite book. She saw Cole's face, younger and harder, marked by the weight of command and the burden of decisions that meant life or death for the men under his care. But she also saw something else, the same protective instinct that had drawn her to him when she watched him with Harper, the same quiet strength that had made her feel safe from the moment they met. "You've been carrying this alone for so long," she whispered, understanding now why sleep sometimes eluded him, why sudden noises made him tense, why he sometimes stared into the distance with eyes that held memories too heavy for words. The next morning brought a transformed world to Cedar Valley. The story had already reached the local newspaper, then the regional outlets, and by noon, news vans from 3 states had descended on the small town like pilgrims seeking a shrine. Brennan's auto repair became an unlikely tourist destination as people drove from hundreds of miles away, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Medal of Honor recipient who had hidden in plain sight among them. Cole found himself thrust into a spotlight he had spent years avoiding, forced to navigate the uncomfortable territory between private citizen and public hero. The phone at the garage rang constantly, reporters and talk show producers offering everything from book deals to movie rights for the story of Operation Valor. Cole declined them all with the same quiet dignity he had shown at the wedding, explaining patiently that some stories belonged to the families who had been preserved rather than the man who had done the preserving. But he did agree to one interview with the local paper that had faithfully covered Harper's school plays and Amanda's classroom achievements, wanting the people of Cedar Valley to understand that heroes weren't mythical figures, but neighbors who chose service over self when the moment demanded it. Business at the garage changed dramatically as word spread throughout the county about the decorated veteran who could fix both transmissions and the broken faith of a community that had forgotten what real courage looked like. Customers who had once barely acknowledged Cole's existence now sought him out, not just for automotive repair, but for the indefinable sense of security that came from being in the presence of someone who had proven themselves under ultimate pressure. He remained the same careful, thorough mechanic he had always been, but now his work carried the added weight of symbol proof that heroism could be found in the most unexpected places, among the most ordinary people. Harper's status at school shifted overnight from the quiet daughter of a single father to the cherished child of a living legend. Her classmates treated her with a mixture of awe and curiosity, wanting to hear stories about her daddy, the war hero, while she struggled to reconcile their excitement with the father she had always known, the man who made her breakfast every morning and helped with homework every night. Amanda found herself fielding questions from other teachers and parents who suddenly saw her marriage in an entirely different light, their earlier whispered doubts about her choice replaced by something approaching envy for the woman who had won the heart of America's most reluctant hero. The annual Operation Valor Heroes ceremony took place 2 weeks later at Cedar Valley Veterans Honor Park, and this time Cole attended. He stood among the families of the men he had saved, listening as General Webb recounted the events of that day 8 years ago, when a young SEAL lieutenant had refused to accept that some missions were impossible. The ceremony was different from the military events Cole remembered, less formal, more intimate, focused not on strategy and tactics, but on the human cost and human triumph that defined every act of genuine heroism. 47 families had gathered to honor the man whose decision to stay and fight had preserved their futures, and their gratitude was overwhelming in its simplicity and sincerity. When called upon to speak, Cole approached the podium with the same reluctance he had shown toward all public recognition. But as he looked out at the faces before him, the wives who still had husbands, the children who still had fathers, the parents whose sons had come home, he found words that had been buried beneath years of survivor's guilt and self-imposed exile from his military identity. "I didn't save anyone that day," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "We saved each other. Every man who made it out of that ambush did so because 47 people refused to give up, refused to leave anyone behind. That's what we do. We take care of each other. That's what makes us strong." The months that followed brought a gradual return to normalcy, though Cedar Valley would never quite be the same small town it had been before that wedding day, when 1,000 SEALs had reminded a community what honor looked like. Cole returned to his daily routine at the garage, but now his work was informed by a sense of completeness he hadn't felt since leaving the military. He was no longer hiding from his past, but integrating it with his present, allowing both versions of himself to coexist in the life he was building with Amanda and Harper. The nightmares that had haunted his sleep began to fade, replaced by dreams that looked forward rather than backward. Amanda's relationship with her family healed slowly but surely, helped by Robert Foster's genuine remorse and his determination to make amends for his spectacular misjudgment. The distinguished lawyer threw himself into veterans' advocacy work, using his legal skills and social connections to support causes that honored the service of men and women like Cole. It was his way of apologizing not just to his son-in-law, but to his own conscience for nearly destroying something precious through ignorance and pride. Patricia Foster became one of Harper's most devoted advocates at school, using her influence in the community to ensure that the daughter of a hero received every opportunity to thrive. Harper grew into her new identity as the child of both a mechanic and a war hero, learning to navigate the attention with the same grace her father had shown in handling his reluctant fame. She began to understand that courage came in many forms, the split-second decisions that saved lives on battlefields, but also the daily choice to show up, work hard, and care for the people depending on you. Her father had always been her hero, but now she understood that the rest of the world was finally catching up to what she had known all along. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Cole and Amanda returned to Riverside Gardens for a private ceremony. Just the three of them, Reverend Matthews, and the late afternoon sun filtering through the same stained glass windows that had witnessed their remarkable day. This time, there were no helicopters, no convoys of SUVs, no formations of elite warriors. Just a man and woman renewing vows that had been tested by revelation and emerged stronger for having survived the truth. Harper stood beside them as they repeated promises that meant more now than they had when first spoken. Promises informed by complete knowledge of who they were and what they meant to each other. As they walked back to the car, Harper skipping ahead while Cole and Amanda followed hand in hand, the setting sun cast long shadows across the garden where their story had taken its most dramatic turn. The chapel stood empty now, waiting for other couples to make their own promises, other families to begin their own journeys. But for one afternoon, it had been the stage for something remarkable, the moment when a community learned that heroes weren't distant figures from history books, but neighbors who chose service over comfort, others over self, courage over fear. The drive home took them past Cedar Valley Veterans Honor Park, where a new addition had been installed, a simple bronze plaque that told the story of Operation Valor and the 47 lives preserved by one man's refusal to abandon his post. Cole slowed the car as they passed, not from pride, but from gratitude for a community that had learned to see beyond surface appearances to the character beneath. Cedar Valley had given him anonymity when he needed to heal, acceptance when he needed to belong, and finally, recognition when he was ready to embrace the fullness of his identity. That night, as Harper slept peacefully in her room and Amanda graded papers at the kitchen table, Cole stood in the garage that had become his sanctuary, surrounded by the tools and projects that had helped him rebuild his life after war. The work was the same. Engines still needed repair, transmissions still required replacement, customers still depended on his expertise. But he was different now, no longer hiding from his past, but carrying it forward as part of who he had become. The mechanic and the war hero weren't separate people, but different facets of the same man, each role informing and strengthening the other. In Cedar Valley, Indiana, population 4,200. People still talked about that wedding day when 1,000 Navy SEALs had surrounded Riverside Gardens to honor one of their own. The story became part of local legend, passed down to children and grandchildren as proof that extraordinary courage could be found in the most ordinary places. But for the Brennan family, it was simply the day when secrets gave way to truth, when love proved stronger than shame, and when a small town learned that heroes weren't mythical figures, but neighbors who chose to serve, protect, and never leave anyone behind.